It was a rainy morning in Tallahassee, and the courthouse was buzzing with anticipation. Inside the courtroom, the usual tension was replaced by something more curious, a palpable sense of disbelief that a showdown was about to take place between two of the most formidable personalities in Florida politics, Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General, and Judge William Henderson, a well-known figure for his unflappable demeanor. Bondi, having recently retired from public office, was back in the game, this time as a lawyer. The case she had taken on was monumental, involving a controversial law that would change the very fabric of state policy. Opposing her in the case was the state, with a seasoned team of lawyers ready to shut her down at every turn. But it wasn't the state's lawyers that everyone was worried about. It was Judge Henderson. Known for his biting sarcasm and quick wit, Henderson was rumored to have little patience for what he considered showboating in his courtroom. And Pam Bondi, with her confident, almost theatrical courtroom presence, was not someone who could easily be dismissed. As the judge entered the courtroom, he scanned the room with his usual cool indifference, barely acknowledging the crowd. Bondi stood at the front, her gaze steady, her posture flawless. She had a reputation for being sharp and composed, qualities that often made her an intimidating figure to those who underestimated her. Henderson wasted no time. He fixed his eyes on Bondi and, with a mocking grin, asked, "So, Ms. Bondi, are you planning to turn this case into a political circus, or will we be treated to some actual legal argument today?" The courtroom chuckled nervously, but Bondi's expression didn't change. Instead, she adjusted her glasses, cleared her throat, and replied with a calmness that seemed to cut through the tension. "Oh, Your Honor, I assure you, no circus here. Just facts. And the facts are about to change everything," she said, her voice unwavering. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but still skeptical. He motioned for her to proceed, clearly expecting the usual political bluster he had become accustomed to in such cases. What he didn't expect was what happened next. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence as Pam Bondi began to lay out her case. At first, Judge Henderson looked uninterested, flipping through some papers on his desk, seemingly more focused on his own thoughts than what Bondi was saying. He barely gave her a glance as she presented her argument, drawing on statutes, precedents, and case law that even some of the state's most experienced attorneys had trouble understanding. Her voice was measured and precise, the way only someone with years of high-stakes legal experience could deliver. She wasn't just reciting legal jargon, she was weaving a web of logic and reason that made her argument impossible to ignore. With each citation, her command of the law became clearer, and Judge Henderson's earlier smugness started to fade. At one point, Bondi quoted a passage from a previous ruling, her words flowing effortlessly. "Your Honor," she said, her eyes narrowing with focus, "in the case of State v. Thomas, the court ruled that laws affecting citizens' fundamental rights must undergo the strictest scrutiny. And if you apply that principle to the statute in question today, it's clear that it does not hold up." Judge Henderson, who had been half leaning back in his chair, suddenly sat up straight. The room held its breath as he looked up, his sharp gaze now fully focused on her. For the first time in the proceeding, he seemed to genuinely acknowledge her legal acumen. He flicked through his own set of papers, then turned his eyes to the state's attorneys, who were beginning to look uneasy. Bondi continued, her confidence growing with each word. She spoke not only of the law but of the principles behind it, freedom, justice, and the very rights that the government was attempting to infringe upon. She wasn't just defending a case, she was defending the ideals that had shaped the foundation of the country. Judge Henderson's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no mockery in it now. Instead, it was the kind of smile reserved for those who had earned his respect. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but steady. "Ms. Bondi," he said, "I must admit, I did not expect this level of, well, legal genius. You've made quite the compelling case. But don't think for a second that I'm going to make this easy for you." The courtroom collectively exhaled, sensing that the tides were turning. Bondi had done what few before her had managed to do, she had gotten under the judge's skin, not with theatrics, but with substance. Now, the real battle was about to begin. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Henderson leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him as he regarded Pam Bondi with an intensity that had shifted the entire dynamic of the hearing. The air seemed to crackle with unspoken recognition. Bondi, however, did not let herself get caught in the moment. She was ready, and every word she spoke from then on felt as though it had been carefully calculated for maximum impact. Henderson's eyes narrowed, not in the typical skeptical way, but with a new edge, one that acknowledged the depth of the legal argument Bondi was presenting. He motioned for the state's lead attorney, Samuel Jensen, to respond. Jensen stood up slowly, adjusting his tie, his face tightening as if steeling himself for what was to come. He had always been confident in front of judges, but there was something different about this courtroom today. Bondi's precise legal framework had shifted the playing field, and he knew he had to come up with something extraordinary to push back. "We understand, Your Honor," Jensen began, his voice steady but laced with a hint of frustration. "But this case is not about abstract principles. This is about the practical needs of our state and the safety of its citizens. What Ms. Bondi is suggesting would unravel the delicate balance of our laws. It would introduce chaos into a system that has worked for decades." Bondi did not flinch. She had anticipated this line of defense. Calmly, she stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor," she said, her voice as sharp as a scalpel, "what Mr. Jensen fails to realize is that true legal stability doesn't come from maintaining a system that restricts freedoms in the name of safety. We must remember that the Constitution was written to ensure that our rights remain unencumbered, even when it's inconvenient for those in power. If we allow this law to stand, it will set a dangerous precedent." Jensen opened his mouth to object, but Henderson raised a hand, silencing him. "Let her finish, Mr. Jensen," the judge said in a tone that brooked no argument. The courtroom fell silent again, the air thick with anticipation. Bondi turned back to Henderson, her eyes never leaving his. She spoke with the kind of clarity that made every word feel like it mattered. "This law, if upheld, would violate not only the spirit of our Constitution but also the trust the citizens of Florida have placed in our system. It would create a slippery slope. And once we start sliding, Your Honor, we may never stop." The judge's fingers tapped the surface of his desk. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his nails, a sign that he was deeply considering her argument. "I see," Henderson finally said, his voice quieter now, reflective. "You've certainly given me much to think about, Ms. Bondi. But as you know, my job is not to be swayed by eloquence. I must weigh the law and the facts." Bondi smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory, it was one of quiet confidence, knowing that the tide was turning. She had done her part. Now it was up to Henderson to decide. As the judge called a brief recess, the room emptied, but whispers of the morning's exchange echoed through the halls. Bondi had made her mark, and everyone knew it. But even with the courtroom split between admiration and skepticism, it was clear that something larger was at play now, something that could change the course of the case, and perhaps the state's future. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as the recess came to an end. The gathered crowd had returned to their seats, and everyone, attorneys, reporters, even spectators, was waiting to see if Pam Bondi's formidable arguments had truly swayed Judge Henderson. The air felt electric, charged with the potential of what was to come. As the judge entered and took his seat, the room fell into an eerie hush. Henderson had been known for his long deliberations, often keeping everyone on edge for hours or even days before issuing a decision. But this time, something was different. He had clearly been affected by the morning's proceedings. "Court is back in session," Judge Henderson announced, his voice carrying through the stillness of the room. His tone was different now, there was no mockery, no sarcasm. It was steady, almost somber. Pam Bondi stood, poised, with a calm demeanor that belied the gravity of the moment. Her legal team flanked her, their faces just as composed, but there was an undercurrent of tension that even the most practiced observers could see. The state's attorneys, however, looked increasingly uneasy. Jensen sat with his arms crossed, his brow furrowed, while his colleagues exchanged whispers. It was clear that Bondi's brilliance had rattled them in a way they hadn't expected. They had underestimated her, thinking that her time in the political spotlight would make her weak in the courtroom. They had been wrong. Judge Henderson adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Bondi," he began, his gaze turning to her with a level of respect that was unmistakable, "you have certainly made a strong case for your position. You have challenged the very foundation of this law, and you've done so with an unexpected clarity and depth." Bondi stood tall, her fingers subtly brushing against the legal documents in front of her. She could feel the weight of the judge's words, but she didn't allow herself to feel complacent. She had been here before, so many times, in fact, and knew that the final moment was still to come. "I appreciate that, Your Honor," she replied, her voice unwavering. "But let's not lose sight of what's truly at stake here. This is about more than just the legality of a single law. It's about the direction we choose to take as a state. Are we going to safeguard our freedoms or abandon them under the guise of safety?" Henderson was silent for a long moment. The courtroom was hanging on his every word. The tension was almost unbearable. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft but resonant. "I've been a judge for many years," he said, pausing for emphasis. "I've seen countless cases, some of them complicated, some of them simple. But rarely have I encountered a case that forced me to confront the very heart of our legal system in the way yours has, Ms. Bondi." He looked around the room, making eye contact with everyone present, before turning his attention back to Bondi. "This law may have been well-intentioned, but it is not consistent with the values this court is sworn to uphold. I am granting your motion to strike down the statute in question." Gasps filled the room as the state's legal team stood up in shock, their faces drained of color. Jensen looked as though he had been punched in the gut, while his colleagues were too stunned to react. The weight of the judge's decision hung heavily in the air. Bondi's eyes narrowed slightly, her lips curving into a small but victorious smile. It wasn't an expression of arrogance, it was the satisfaction of having fought, and won, on the basis of what was right, not just what was popular. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said softly, not just out of courtesy, but with a genuine respect for the courage it had taken to make such a ruling. Judge Henderson didn't return the smile, but there was a new level of respect in his gaze. "The ruling stands. Court is adjourned." As the gavel struck the desk, signaling the end of the hearing, the room erupted into a flurry of activity. Reporters scrambled to get the story out, while attorneys from both sides began to gather their things. But for Pam Bondi, it wasn't the noise that mattered. It was the quiet confidence of having done what she came to do, change the law and leave a lasting impact on the system. As she exited the courtroom, her legal team gathered around her, exchanging smiles and congratulations. But she knew that this victory wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The news of Judge Henderson's decision spread like wildfire across Florida and the nation. Bondi's victory in the courtroom was being hailed as a monumental moment, one that had far-reaching implications. For many, it was the culmination of a brilliant legal mind challenging the established order and winning not just for herself, but for the principles that governed the very fabric of the law. In the days following the ruling, media outlets were all over the case. Bondi found herself on the front pages of newspapers and the lead story of nearly every news broadcast. It wasn't just the win itself that was drawing attention, it was the manner in which she had secured it. Her argument had been grounded in deep legal principles, but it was the sheer force of her intellect and the clarity of her reasoning that left people in awe. It had been a true clash of the titans, and Bondi had come out on top. But while the world outside buzzed with praise, Pam Bondi knew that her work was far from over. Winning in court was only the first step. The law had been struck down, yes, but there were powerful interests at play that wouldn't let the issue go so easily. There were whispers that the state's political machine, from the governor's office to powerful lobbyists, was already considering their next move. That evening, Bondi sat in her office, reviewing the judge's written opinion with a glass of water in hand. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows on her desk. She could almost hear the voices of her opponents, even though they were far from her, plotting, scheming, strategizing how to undo what had just been achieved. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a familiar name, Governor Adam Westbrook. Bondi's expression tightened. Westbrook had been one of the architects of the law that had just been struck down. His political career had been built on tough-on-crime policies, and he wasn't the type to back down from a fight. She picked up the phone. "Pam," Westbrook's voice came through, cordial but laced with an edge. "I'll keep this brief. I wanted to personally let you know that I disagree with your position on the ruling. You may have won in the courtroom, but there's more at stake here than your legal victory. This is about the safety of Floridians." Bondi leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "I understand your concerns, Governor. But the Constitution is more important than political expediency. We cannot sacrifice our freedoms in the name of safety, not when it's the very thing that makes us who we are." There was a moment of silence on the other end, and then Westbrook chuckled, though there was no warmth in it. "You're a smart woman, Pam. But this isn't over. You'll see that soon enough. The legislature will act, and we'll be right back at square one." "I'm sure you will," Bondi replied, her tone unwavering. "But let's be clear about one thing, Governor. If you try to push this through again, I will be waiting for you with the same arguments, the same legal precision. And I won't back down." The line went quiet for a moment. Westbrook didn't say anything else. He simply hung up. Bondi put the phone down, her mind racing. She knew that the next battle would be more difficult, more complex. The ruling had set a precedent, but powerful forces wouldn't stop just because of one court decision. She had gained a victory, but the fight for the soul of the state was far from over. The days that followed saw a flurry of activity. Lobbyists and politicians, sensing a potential crack in the system, began to rally behind efforts to introduce a new law, one that would circumvent the court's ruling. Bondi was constantly on the defensive, her team working around the clock to prepare for the next round of challenges. But as the legislative sessions continued and the media hype began to settle, Bondi found herself growing more and more determined. It wasn't just about winning another legal battle, it was about ensuring that the people of Florida understood the stakes. She needed to make sure the public saw what was truly at risk, what the government was willing to sacrifice in order to push its agenda. She took her case to the public. Speeches, interviews, town halls, Bondi made her voice heard, speaking directly to the people. And slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Public opinion shifted, and the pressure on lawmakers mounted. The very law that had once seemed like a political inevitability now faced growing opposition from the grassroots level. And then, as the legislative session reached its peak, something unexpected happened. Governor Westbrook, under increasing pressure, made an announcement. "I respect the decision of the court," he said in a rare public address, "and after careful consideration, I have decided to withdraw the new proposal from the legislative agenda. It's time to move forward, to focus on real solutions, and to respect the constitutional rights of all Floridians." Bondi couldn't believe it. The battle had been won, not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. It was a victory for the Constitution, for freedom, and for the rule of law. As she watched the news broadcast on her television, a smile finally tugged at the corners of her lips. It had been a long, hard fight, but in the end, the law had prevailed, and so had she. The victory celebration was brief but sweet. Pam Bondi had earned her triumph, and for a moment, everything seemed in its proper place. Florida was abuzz with the news that Governor Westbrook had backed down, his proposal withdrawn. The media hailed it as a huge win for constitutional rights, and Bondi's name was all over the headlines. It felt like the end of a long journey, a victory not only for her legal prowess but for the principle that justice must always be upheld, regardless of political pressures. For a brief moment, it seemed like the storm had passed. Bondi took a few days to rest, spending time with her family and reflecting on everything that had transpired. But she knew, deep down, that this sense of calm was only temporary. In the quiet of her office late one evening, as she flipped through a pile of papers, her phone buzzed again. The name on the screen was unfamiliar, Senator Carla Jennings. Bondi hesitated before answering, not sure what the call could be about. "Ms. Bondi," came the voice on the other end, warm but with an unmistakable edge of urgency. "I'm afraid the battle isn't quite over." Bondi sat up straighter. She had a feeling this was coming. "What's going on?" "I'm sure you're aware of the pressure building from certain quarters," Jennings said, her voice lowering. "There's a growing coalition of lawmakers, both Republicans and Democrats, who are determined to reintroduce the law in a different form. They've learned from their past mistakes. They're strategizing a way to get this passed without hitting the same legal roadblocks." Bondi's mind raced. She had expected some form of resistance, but this was different. They weren't just rehashing the old arguments, they were finding new ways to circumvent the ruling. It was going to be a more insidious fight, one that would take everything she had to navigate. "So, what's the plan?" Bondi asked, her tone steely. "There's a push to implement this through a series of smaller, less obvious measures," Senator Jennings explained. "They're talking about piggybacking the provisions onto other, unrelated bills. They think they can sneak it through, without it being immediately obvious that it's the same law you took down." Bondi took a deep breath. It was the kind of political maneuvering she had seen before, backdoor deals, legislation snuck in under the radar. It was underhanded, but it wasn't unexpected. The political machine would always find a way to advance its agenda if it thought it could get away with it. "This could get ugly," Bondi said quietly, already knowing the answer. "What's the next step?" "Your involvement is going to be crucial. If you don't step in soon, this could slip through before anyone even knows what happened. I'll be pushing from the inside, but we need your voice, your legal expertise, to challenge these measures before they even have a chance to gain traction." Bondi knew that Senator Jennings was right. The fight wasn't over. It wasn't even close to being over. The political forces that had already been at work to undermine her success were regrouping, and they were more determined than ever. This time, they weren't just dealing with a single law, they were trying to make sure the principle she had fought for would never get in their way again. She didn't hesitate. "Get me everything you've got. I'll start preparing for what's next. We're not letting this happen. Not on my watch." The call ended, but Bondi didn't put her phone down. She sat back in her chair, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. She had known this was coming. The political game wasn't about one battle, it was about an ongoing fight for control, a constant push and pull between those in power and those who refused to let that power go unchecked. The sound of her phone buzzing again broke her train of thought. This time, it was an email from her legal team. The title read, "Urgent, New Developments in Legislative Maneuvers." She clicked on the email with a grim resolve. It had begun. The next chapter of the fight was about to unfold. In the following weeks, Bondi and her team worked tirelessly, tracking every bill, every proposal that came through the legislative chambers. They dug through loopholes, analyzed language, and kept a careful eye on every new piece of legislation that seemed even remotely related to the law she had struck down. They knew that time was working against them. Once a bill was passed and signed into law, it would be much harder to challenge. One evening, Bondi found herself standing in front of a group of journalists, preparing to give a statement. She had been invited to speak at a rally against the latest push to reintroduce the law. The turnout was large, more than she had expected. The people were with her, and they were ready for the next fight. As she stepped up to the podium, she scanned the crowd. The energy was palpable, and it fueled her resolve. She knew that the path ahead would be grueling, but it was one she was more than ready to walk. "Thank you all for being here today," Bondi began, her voice firm and confident. "What we're fighting for isn't just a legal victory. It's the protection of our most fundamental rights. What we're facing now is a well-organized effort to bypass the will of the people and the rule of law. But I can promise you this, we will not let that happen. We will stand together, fight together, and make sure that Florida remains a place where the Constitution is respected." The crowd erupted in applause, but Bondi's thoughts were already turning to the battle ahead. The storm was coming again, and this time, it wouldn't be easy. But with the support of the people, and the strength of her conviction, she knew she could weather it. As the days passed, Pam Bondi's fight escalated into a battle on two fronts, inside the halls of the legislature and outside in the court of public opinion. The push to reintroduce the controversial law was not only relentless, but also growing more cunning. Behind closed doors, powerful lawmakers and lobbyists worked overtime, crafting a new set of proposals designed to bypass the legal challenges Bondi had previously won. But Bondi wasn't about to let them succeed. In the weeks following her public rally, Bondi and her legal team became a well-oiled machine. They monitored every bill, combed through every piece of proposed legislation, and identified even the slightest hints that could lead to another attempt to reinstate the law. They worked tirelessly, late into the night, preparing their next moves. It didn't take long before they uncovered a series of amendments buried in a broader public safety bill, a bill that seemed unrelated to the original law but contained several key provisions that mirrored the provisions Bondi had successfully struck down. The amendments were subtle, cleverly worded, and hidden within a much larger and complex piece of legislation. As Bondi pored over the text, her heart sank. This was exactly what she had feared. The law was trying to sneak its way back into effect under the radar, disguised as part of a larger public safety initiative. She knew that this would be their last chance to stop it. If these amendments passed, there would be no going back. The clock was ticking. The legislative session was nearing its end, and Bondi had to act fast. She called Senator Carla Jennings to discuss their next move. "We have less than a week," she said, urgency evident in her voice. "We need to get in front of this bill before it gets voted on. We can't let them slip this by." "I agree," Jennings replied, her voice steady despite the mounting pressure. "I'll speak with the leadership, but we need more than just words. We need to expose this before it's too late. We need a groundswell of public opposition." Bondi nodded, already formulating a plan. She knew that this wasn't just about the legal fight anymore, it was about making sure the people understood what was at stake. If they could mobilize the public once more, rally the same energy that had carried them through the initial victory, then the political machine behind the bill wouldn't stand a chance. Within hours, Bondi's team was on the phone with activists, journalists, and community leaders. A new round of rallies was organized. Bondi herself would appear on every major news outlet, once again speaking out against the measures hidden within the bill. The goal was clear: shine a light on the deceitful nature of the amendments and make sure that every Floridian knew what was happening behind the scenes. It didn't take long before the media caught on. Headlines exploded with terms like "backdoor legislation" and "Florida's fight for freedom intensifies." The pressure was building, and legislators, once too focused on their own political agendas, now found themselves having to answer to their constituents. Bondi knew that every moment counted. As she prepared for an important press conference, she received a call from Governor Adam Westbrook's office. It was an unexpected move, but one she had anticipated. "Pam," the governor's voice crackled through the line, "I'd like to have a word. I think you and I need to sit down. This escalation isn't good for either of us." Bondi took a deep breath, her mind racing. Westbrook, always a strategic player, was trying to reassert control over the situation. She couldn't afford to let him dictate the terms. "I'm listening," she replied coolly. "I'm offering a compromise," Westbrook said. We could back down on these amendments if you agree to stop the public campaign. We'll tweak the bill to address some of the concerns, but no more media, no more rallies. Just get this under control." Bondi could hear the calculation in his voice. This was a power play. Westbrook wanted to regain control, to make this about political negotiation instead of legal principles. But she knew better. "Governor," she said firmly, "this isn't a negotiation. You don't get to sacrifice the rights of Floridians just to save face. This fight is about more than just this bill, it's about what kind of state we want to be. A state that respects the law, or one that allows powerful interests to subvert the Constitution." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a frustrated sigh. "I won't back down, Pam. We'll see who wins this." The call ended, and Bondi's resolve strengthened. She couldn't afford to compromise on this. If she did, it would be a betrayal of everything she had fought for. This was about more than just politics, it was about principle. The day of the final vote arrived. Bondi stood before the press, her team behind her, as she delivered a passionate plea to the public. This isn't just about a legal challenge. This is about the future of our democracy. Our freedoms are not for sale, and we will not let anyone take them from us, no matter how they try to sneak it past us. Her words resonated, and the rallying cry was heard loud and clear across Florida. The phone lines lit up, the emails poured in, and legislators felt the weight of the people's will. By the time the vote took place, the tide had shifted. Public pressure, combined with Bondi's relentless legal strategy, forced the legislature to back down. The bill, with its controversial amendments, was defeated. Bondi had done it again. The law was not only struck down, it was now politically radioactive. No one dared to push such an agenda again, knowing that Florida's citizens would rise up against it. As she walked out of the courthouse one last time, her heart was filled with the satisfaction of a hard-fought victory. It had been a battle, a war even. But in the end, the rule of law had prevailed. Bondi knew the fight was never truly over, there would always be more battles to fight, but for now, she could take a moment to enjoy the peace. She had secured a future where the Constitution would always stand, and she had played an integral role in protecting it. The victory celebrations were over. Pam Bondi knew that the fight had taken its toll, on her, her team, and even on Florida itself. The relentless pressure of battling political forces that had sought to strip away the rights of the people had left her exhausted, but it also left her with a sense of accomplishment. She had taken on a system that believed it could bypass the Constitution and had come out victorious, not just for herself, but for every Floridian who had placed their trust in her. The weeks following the final vote were a blur of press conferences, interviews, and backroom discussions. Bondi's name was now synonymous with legal brilliance and political courage. She had made history, becoming one of the most respected figures in the state, not just because of the legal battles she had won, but because she had shown that one person could still stand up against the powerful forces that sought to undermine the very principles of justice. In the quiet moments, away from the cameras and the crowds, Bondi would reflect on what she had accomplished. She had always known that the law could be a powerful force for good, but now, more than ever, she understood its importance in protecting the rights of individuals against the overreach of government. She had faced down the forces of the political elite, and, against all odds, had emerged victorious. But there was something more at stake in all of this, something that had driven her from the very beginning. She wasn't just fighting for legal victories. She was fighting for a future where every citizen, regardless of their political beliefs, had their constitutional rights respected. The battle had been long, but it had made her realize something fundamental: politics might change, and the landscape of Florida might evolve, but the Constitution would remain a steadfast pillar in the face of it all. Now, as she sat at her desk, flipping through the case files one final time, Bondi knew it was time to move on. She had given everything to this fight, and there would be no more courtroom battles for her in this chapter of her life. She had secured her legacy. But as she glanced at the piles of letters of support from ordinary citizens, many who had never expected someone like her to stand up for their rights, she realized that the fight for the future would continue. Not in courtrooms, not in legislative halls, but in the hearts and minds of the people. In their belief that democracy and justice could still prevail. And that was where her true impact had been felt, because she had ignited a spark. She had reminded the people of Florida what it meant to stand for freedom. She had made them remember that the Constitution wasn't just a document to be interpreted by politicians. It was a living, breathing protector of the values that made America what it was. Bondi's phone buzzed, and she picked it up absent-mindedly, already knowing it was another congratulatory message. But as she saw the name on the screen, Governor Westbrook, she paused. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Governor. Pam, Westbrook's voice came through, surprisingly amicable. I wanted to congratulate you. I've always respected your tenacity and your commitment to the law. You've left your mark on this state. Bondi smiled softly, leaning back in her chair. Thank you, Governor. It wasn't about leaving a mark. It was about ensuring that the law stands above all else. There was a pause on the other end before Westbrook spoke again. I suppose you're right. The people have spoken. You've won this round. I've come to respect that. Bondi could sense the sincerity in his voice, but there was also a recognition of the deeper truth. The political winds might shift again, but the essence of democracy, of freedom, was something that could not be taken away so easily. And she had done her part to protect it. As she hung up, Bondi looked out of her office window, the sun setting on the horizon. It was a peaceful moment, one that felt earned after all the long months of struggle. She knew she could walk away now, knowing that the legacy of her work would continue to reverberate throughout Florida. The challenges would never stop. The fight for freedom, justice, and the Constitution would continue on in different forms, in different battles. But Pam Bondi had shown the world that one person could stand up to the powerful and fight not just for herself, but for everyone who believed that the law could be a force for good. And as the final gavel fell on her public career, she knew one thing above all: the fight for justice would never end. But as long as there were people like her, fighting with unwavering conviction, it would always be a fight worth having.